You're going to learn a lot more about America's rather brief adventures in imperialism next year when you take U.S. history. As you'll see from this map, many of the specks of territory we acquired were small Pacific islands. Any guess about why we wanted those little purple dots? And hint, it has to do with the Industrial Revolution. There was a lot of trade in the Pacific Ocean by the end of the 19th century, and the trade goods were now carried on steamships. These ships sailed faster, and they weren't dependent on the wind, but they did need lots and lots of coal to operate. So most of these islands were actually acquired as coaling stations. Hawaii and Alaska were, of course, annexed and eventually made states. The Philippines was a different story. We acquired those in the Spanish-American War, fought a nasty war with the Filipinos who wanted to be independent, and finally granted the Philippines independence after World War II. But today we're going to focus on Cuba. According to this map, was Cuba ever a colony of the United States? No, but we did get a naval base on Guantanamo Bay, and as you'll see, there's a very strong argument that the relations that the United States had with Cuba were an element of imperialism. We've had very bad relations with Cuba since its communist revolution in 1959. So, did the Cubans kick the U.S. Navy out of Guantanamo Bay? No. We still have a base there, and we are, in fact, housing prisoners of the war on terror at Guantanamo Bay to this day, even though it's very controversial, even though the president has said he'd like to end that policy. Just hard to find someplace else to send them. So, why did the U.S. care so much about Cuba in the first place? I think the map offers a couple of hints. First, it's very close to the United States. If a foreign power controlled Cuba, it would pose a serious threat. And what's that area circled in red? Well, it's where the Panama Canal is located. All shipping trade with the West Coast and with Asia still passes through that very narrow and potentially difficult to defend space. So, do you know of a time in the last 75 years that we thought there was a major military threat to the U.S. from Cuba? In 1962, the U.S. government discovered that the Soviet Union had stationed nuclear weapons on Cuba, weapons that could hit most of the U.S. fired from so close by. It's probably the closest we've come to a world war in my lifetime, but the Soviet Union backed down and withdrew the missiles. Whew! So, why were the Russians able to put nuclear weapons in Cuba anyway? They had formed an alliance with Cuba's communist leader, Fidel Castro. But that begs another question. How did a country just 90 miles away from capitalism and democracy's world headquarters end up ruled by a follower of Karl Marx? To get there, let's back up and look at some imperialist and post-imperialist history. Actually, Thomas Jefferson thought Cuba should join the United States. So did John Quincy Adams. So did many political leaders from slaveholding states who thought it might help balance out the northern states. Cuba is very close to the U.S. and commanded naval approaches to Florida. American businessmen also had substantial investments on the island. And of course, Spain had already lost most of its colonies during and immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, a development that Americans had applauded. So when Cubans rose up against the Spanish in a 10-year war from 1868 to 1878, the American public generally sympathized with the rebels. But the U.S. government chose not to intervene directly at that time. The Civil War was only just finished. Americans were tired of fighting. We didn't want to spend the money in our depleted treasury. Rebellion broke out in Cuba again in 1895, and once again, Americans generally supported the rebels. Now the Civil War was a generation behind us, and Americans weren't so war-weary. They also worried increasingly about falling behind the European powers and Japan, all of which were busy gobbling up territory. Remember, this is a time when people took the notion that survival of the fittest might apply to nations and peoples very seriously. President Grover Cleveland did not want to go to war over Cuba, but he did in this speech acknowledge that the U.S. had some important interests in Cuba. So according to this speech, what kind of interests, what motives might we have for intervening in Cuba? Well, I hope you remember that economic interests, the need for raw materials such as sugar in the case of Cuba, the need to protect investment, the need for markets for U.S. goods, these were all important reasons for imperial expansion. What alternative did President Cleveland propose to the Spanish? What would you guess home rule meant? Basically, he suggested that Spain let Cubans run their own affairs and keep Cuba pretty much as a colony in name only. He saw this as a way the Spaniards could salvage their pride and he could get out of a pickle. It didn't work. The Spanish, in fact, put down the Cuban revolt especially brutally. The leader of the Spanish forces, General Valeriano Weyler, has the dubious distinction of having invented the term and concept of concentration camps. I'll let Ms. Jacobs handle the Spanish translation. I may very well pronounce it. I don't know if that's Weiler or Weiler, wrong, depending on how German he has kept his name. At any rate, the concentration camps were created to isolate fighters from civilian support. Almost 100,000 people are estimated to have died, mostly non-combatants. Out of a total population of less than 2 million, they died basically of starvation and disease. Here you see a couple of actual photos of victims, both living and dead. Cuban leaders in the United States and their American sympathizers, including some with substantial business interests on the island, raised money and smuggled supplies and men onto the island. They also waged a very effective propaganda war in the press. So here's an image that appeared in newspaper articles about Cuba. Senator Proctor, by the way, was a U.S. senator who had opposed U.S. intervention in Cuba, then took a highly publicized trip to Cuba and announced that he had changed his mind. And he reported on what he saw, particularly on starving children. You see the headlines that went with the story and the illustration. This is pretty powerful stuff. And then on February 15, 1898, an explosion ripped through the American battleship Maine, which was sitting in Havana Harbor. There's actually been a lot of forensic history done about this in recent years, and it's pretty clear that what happened was a boiler blew up. But Americans were very quick to blame the Spanish government. The explosion, after all, had sunk the ship and killed 260 sailors. 2 months later, the slogan, "Remember the Maine," carried the U.S. into the war with Spain. What Teddy Roosevelt, I believe it was, called a splendid little war. So here's an editorial about the attack. It's also in your notes templates. We've seen economic motivations for intervention in Cuba. We've seen humanitarian motivations. What motivations does this suggest? Well, it mentions humanitarian concerns, but note that the editorial makes a military and nationalist argument. We will fall behind if we don't meet this challenge. So here's a little more propaganda. This is a sketch of a supposed Spanish firing squad. I'm sure there were Spanish firing squads, by the way. But what's the subliminal message? What emotions is this tapping into? Remember that while more and more Catholics were coming to America, the United States was still very much a Protestant-dominated nation, and in fact, during this period, there was a lot of suspicion of Catholics. So this is pretty clearly anti-Catholic propaganda. Look at how this sword is parallel with the crosses, and the priests appear to be blessing an execution. In other words, a kind of missionary zeal, call it Protestant missionary zeal, was another motive for this form of American imperialism. What does anarchy mean? Why might this be an argument for intervention? Well, anarchy is the chaos that comes when there's no effective government. Remember, Cuba is just 90 miles from the mainland United States, so the argument here is the U.S. is endangered by the violence in Cuba. So what motive for imperialist intervention does this suggest? We already know that Americans like to think of themselves as friends of the revolution, so you have Uncle Sam helping out a fellow revolutionary, right? But do you detect just a touch of white man's burden as well? Note that Cuba's personification is as a person of color, and indeed many Cubans had African roots and had come to the island initially as slaves. Okay, this video clip, you know what, why am I There, sorry about that. The video clip will review some of the history we've just discussed and take us forward very quickly to the 1960s. The photo on top shows triumphant Cuban freedom fighters, and the photo on the bottom shows President Kennedy signing the trade embargo against Cuba. One little historical anecdote. We now know that before cutting off all U.S. trade with Cuba, President Kennedy asked his press secretary to get him 1,200 Cuban cigars. And now the slides seem to be working again. The embargo has now gone on for more than 50 years. One rather amusing and fun result is that Cuba is filled with vintage American cars that the ingenious Cubans have managed to keep running. The embargo has been tough on Cubans, but so has socialist central planning, which has produced scarcity and inhibited economic growth. Note the comparison with Costa Rica, that's in blue here, another Latin American country that has pursued more open economic policies. Note that Cuba's GDP began to improve in the 1990s at a time when the government let up a little on its control over the economy. In recent years, by the way, the U.S. has also reduced restrictions on exports to Cuba, especially of food and medicine, as long as they're sold to private individuals or enterprises, including charitable organizations, and not to the government. But this raises the question of whether the Cuban economy might open up more if the embargo was ended. By the way, the Castro regime, Cuba, is now run by Fidel Castro's brother, continues to blame the embargo for most of Cuba's economic ills. Cuba also has an unimpressive human rights record. You have a report from Human Rights Watch in your notes template. The bottom line from that report, quote, Cuba remains the only country in Latin America that represses virtually all forms of political dissent. These charts show that Cuba is a leading jailer of journalists and that people still leave Cuba by the thousands every day, although many of them are really seeking economic opportunity as much as fleeing political oppression. But here again, maybe once Cuba's government does not feel as threatened, it will ease up on its own people. At the end of 2014, President Obama announced plans to end the embargo on Cuba, lifting in particular some travel restrictions and other things he can do with presidential power. Most of this would have to be done by Congress, and just this week, a bipartisan group of Republican and Democratic senators introduced a bill in Congress to lift the embargo. But many political leaders, including many political leaders among the Cuban immigrant community, oppose this step, and it's going to be subject to a lot of debate in the coming weeks and months. So think about your own position on this. But first, this video clip will show you a television debate about the issue. It took place before President Obama's announcement, by the way. You also have some pro and con readings in your notes template. If you don't have time to get to these and discuss them, be prepared to answer questions about these arguments on your test. So, what do you think? Is the embargo a remaining vestige of imperialism, or is it a good strategy for promoting change in Cuba?